Hi, welcome to Meaning of Life TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I host a show on Meaning of Life's sister site, Blogging Heads TV, called Culturally Determined. But today we're on Meaning of Life, and my guest is Catherine Nichols. Catherine, could you introduce yourself?
Uh, Hi. I don't know what else to say. I'm Catherine Nichols. I'm a writer. I'm excited to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks for coming on. Our topic today is an essay you wrote in the online magazine Eon, um, which is actually spelled Aeon, but we'll include the link in the links below. And the headline is "The Good Guy, Bad Guy Myth." Subhead: Pop culture today is obsessed with the battle between good and evil. Traditional folk tales never were. What changed? So, can you kind of outline the argument of your piece and also talk about why you were interested in exploring this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that there's this. There's a lot of ways we could start. There's this group of like pop culture. I don't even want to. It's like movies, books, comics that all have. Like Star Wars is sort of based on the Joseph Campbell hero myth. Joseph Campbell and George Lucas talk about a lot when it first came out, and Tolkien was famously, a scholar of Old English epics and language and everything. There's this idea that these things are based in these kind of ancient folkloric traditions, and they have all these old ancient tropes, and they have this feeling of being kind of a timeless, universal fight of good versus evil. And I was it was actually a kid who asked me, was reading some Norse myths, and said, so is Thor a good guy or a bad guy in this? And I was just like, no, that's wrong. It's like a category error. It's like Thor is a god. Thor is something so much bigger than a good guy or a bad guy. But if you read Marvel, Thor has to be worthy to hold his hammer. That there's some kind of moral requirement and sense that he's standing up for his values. And I was thinking, not only does Thor not stand up for his values in, the prose Edda, the poetic Edda, but I couldn't think of any ancient story, like whether it's, the Iliad or Three Little Pigs or Cinderella, where anybody stands up for their values at all. It seems like values are just never a point of conflict in any of these old stories. And even if you say, you can put things in a kind of like a kind of surface way, like say, oh, well, Cinderella was as good as she was beautiful, and that's why she wins. But there's no actual part of the story where her goodness has any causal power to change the outcome. It's like, for her to win, she only has to be beautiful. And then there's only versions where she's tricky and versions where she's obedient, and but like to make her into a modern good guy, Walt Disney had to give her all these little mice and birds, these little friends who would come and do things, and they'd like, the stepmother locks her up and they get the key and stuff. That's what you have to do to the story of Cinderella to make her ostensible goodness have any power to affect the ending. So I started thinking, so why do we have these stories about people who are standing up for their values, and why is that so closely associated with folklore? So I just did a bunch of research, and I found that idea came up very closely with the rise of nationalism in the Enlightenment, modern nationalism, where the idea of the nation is that, you'd have values. Like, to be an American, you're sort of signing up for American values in theory, rather than being connected by an ethnicity or some agreement about land use or something like that, that there's the idea that we all value the Constitution or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very new concept of the nation. And it has this mythology associated with it, which is that that our stories of conflict are incredibly reliably stories of conflict of values rather than conflict over resources or, excuse me, or dinner, all the other things that people have conflicts over in older stories. Anyway, so the more I did this research, the more I found that it feels a lot like it's a moral question, whether you're a good guy or a bad guy. But it's not rooted in a moral vision. It's rooted in a political vision of nationalism, of specifically binding together a large group, sort of with something, a story that's kind of thicker than blood.
Mm-hmm. And you see the Grimm brothers as kind of like a key turning point in this transformation of folkloric tales.
Yeah, because an essay and not a book. I think in some ways the Grimm brothers, they're definitely not the only ones. I think they were a turning point, but the Joseph Ritson version of Robin Hood, which is the first Robin Hood in which he robs from the rich to give to the poor, which was also coming up at this exact same time. That's even slightly before the Grimm brothers. So like I just want to be very clear that I don't think that they're the only people who were starting to use folklore in this kind of moralistic, nationalistic way, but they were, I think they were very influential in our thinking of stories like Cinderella as being something that's about a good person versus a bad person, as opposed to just people fighting.
Yeah. So your essay made me think back on, like, in the Iliad, who, I guess we're supposed to root for the Greeks or the Achaeans, depending on the translation. But Achilles is the hero of the Iliad, but he's a total asshole. And the only admirable thing about him is like his fighting ability.
Yeah, and like if you had to choose a good guy, it's like you probably choose like Hector before you choose Achilles. But it's just a much more complex story in terms of the causes and effects of actions. It's like what's at stake for each person, what feelings they're capable of feeling. The
Iliad ends with the desecration of Hector's body, which is not a fairy tale ending for anyone.
Yeah, and then it's also like the grief of his father. It's like there's something so humane about the storytelling that doesn't desecrate anyone. It's like everyone is fully human. They've all got, terrible weaknesses and overwhelming feelings and strengths and moments of nobility, because there isn't this idea that they have to each symbolize an emotion or a value. Like, if you one thing that good guys and bad guys stories have often is that people can switch sides based on like a change of heart. Like if they have, if Darth Vader stops feeling angry and starts feeling love, he will stop being a bad guy and switch to Luke Skywalker's team in this war they're having. And you just think, while you're watching Star Wars, you're like, oh, I'm watching kind of this beautiful human moment between father and son. But then if you compare that to something like the Iliad, you see that the war they're having never prevents anyone in that story from having a full range of human emotions. But the good guys, bad guys filter. Like if you're telling a good guys, bad guys story, you're sort of inherently limiting all the good guys to the kinds of feelings that good guys would have, the kind of tactics and the kind of, I guess, level of hatred or whatever it is that that each side represents. And that the bad guys, if they were truly loving, if they truly valued their children or human life or whatever, they wouldn't be bad guys. Which is, it's kind of a morally disastrous way to think. It's like when you think like, well, what's the human version of this? Like, is there an actual real life world in which people like actually truly have no loyalty on one side of a fight and like just casually punish their own allies? And it's like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, everyone's human on both sides of every fight. It doesn't mean that the fights aren't brutal. It just means that it's never actually a fight of one team that has loyalty and the other team that has no loyalty.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting threads in there. One thing you made me think was, it would be the Darth Vader coming over to the good side, the light side, or Professor Snape in Harry Potter actually being a good guy after you think he was a bad guy. Yeah, this has no like parallel in the real world. It's not like Kim Jong-un
it just does not exist.
Is going to realize the error of his ways and dedicate himself to the forces of good. And another thread is that in the Iliad, maybe the analog for like kind of Darth Vader's moment of redemption is like Priam's story and the humanizing grief that we see him display for his son Hector, which would be very hard to have. You can't imagine Saruman or some other big bad kind of retaining their enemy status while still being presented with humanity. Be like, if they were presented with humanity, that means they saw the light and were coming to the good side.
Exactly, and that's why I think like this. That's why I just think that this is so that they feel like they're teaching us better morals, but they're actually preventing us from understanding. I don't really think people don't understand, like the full moral engagement of human life. But I think that while your mindset is in this good guy, bad guy, while you're thinking in those terms, you couldn't have a fully human bad guy that has like the full range of the kinds of feelings that good guys would have, who wouldn't switch sides, because like that's what the sides mean. That the terms of engagement are that they have different moral qualities. Which is, that's what Enlightenment era nationalism was all about, is trying to figure out what moral qualities certain groups of people have. And, when you look at the difference between ancient slavery and American slavery, one of the big differences is the idea that, that a certain group of people, American slaves, had certain moral qualities that meant that they needed to be locked up. And that's inside this story. That's part of the sort of like the logical, entailment, I guess, of this story, is that groups of people rather than individuals have moral qualities. And if people on the other side of whatever fence had the same moral qualities that you pride yourself on, they wouldn't be there. They would have joined your team a long time ago. I feel like like a little bad saying that when, Black Panther has just come out and like, I definitely want to go see it. But at the same time, like, I think this idea has a lot of potential for abuse that we've seen, pretty consistently since people have been using it.
Yeah. So there's a deep human urge to identify yourself with part of a tribe and then police the boundaries of the tribe and see your own tribe as the good ones and see the other tribe as the bad ones. So that's in some ways...
Well, that's the question. Is I don't know that people have always seen the other tribe as the bad ones. I mean, I think people have always seen the other tribe as adversaries, definitely. But I don't know that people have always seen the other tribe as lacking... As
inherently having bad moral qualities. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting distinction.
It's reflected in these stories anyway.
Okay, so I think there's an instinct, and I'm drawing on some of the writings of my boss here at Meaning of Life TV and blogging as Robert Wright in books like Moral Animal and Non-Zero, to put yourself in a tribe and then see who is an ally and who is not an ally, and
yes.
Those often come along tribal boundaries and probably derive from like the evolutionary psychology view of small human groups in like hunter-gatherer societies, and then the other group is a threat, and so we like tell a story about how it's okay to kill them because of something, some like thing about them that's not as good as our tribe. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I think that I think when you're talking about a nation that's so much larger than any kinship group, I think that that's when there's something wrong with the people outside our group. That's when that has to really kick in. Because I think that if you're talking about, these much smaller nations, I don't think you need that level of persuasion to get people to suit up and join the army. I don't think that, or at least it doesn't seem like you do, because after all, in the Iliad, to go back to that one, there isn't a moral difference between the two sides. Nobody considers that there's a moral difference between the two sides. The reason that they are on opposite sides is just a network of agreements and loyalties and family bonds that, marriage and stuff like that. And they don't.
And there's gods who are intervening on either side. So because of the multiplicity of gods in Greek mythology, some I don't remember the split, but some are I guess Athena was with Odysseus, and maybe Ares was with the Trojans, and so
and they had Venus, I think, with Aeneas, right? I don't want to get it all wrong. I
haven't delved into Greek mythology in about 10 years, so I might be misremembering some of this. Getting back to this idea that like the heroes in the ancient epics were not moral exemplars, Odysseus that's more ostensibly like a hero story, like it focuses on just him. I suppose the Iliad, which is focusing on a lot of different characters, and he has myriad adventures, and he has a goal of getting back to his homeland of Ithaca. But when you read his admirable trait, his heroic trait is like his trickiness and wiliness, which is not maybe that's like Donald Trump's moral trait as well, is his wiliness. Not an absolute good, like he's always like kind to animals or something that we can all get behind.
Yeah, but I think so. If you take away the idea that you should learn values, or that your identity comes from your values, or that that stories need to teach you how to have values. If you just think the whole the whole worth of this story, the importance of this story it just comes from, is this interesting? I think a lot of folklore, including these ancient epics, like a lot of it comes right from that, of just like, well, it's interesting, you know? It's more interesting to tell versions of Cinderella in which she's tricky, in which she's, you know, disobedient and, you know, sometimes obedient, sometimes disobedient. It's more interesting if you tell more different versions. It's more interesting if you tell stories about the peasant who got a sausage stuck to her nose, you know, like that's funny. And I think the idea that we each need to have a personal code of values and that it's an important part of our identity that we need to like pass on to the children, like our unique personal code of values. And that I think is also, let's say, a post-printing press kind of idea. That, you know, it existed before, but I don't think that it was as dominant as it is now. I think the idea that stories need to teach is probably minor in the more distant past compared to stories being entertaining and like cool, you know, like it's fun to hang out with Odysseus. And if everybody is so tightly interdependent for all of their survival and their ideas and their conversation, everything in your society, you don't necessarily need to take time out to teach. These are our group values. Like that's pretty much like what everyone's just going to absorb just by living.
Something that a hinge point that you don't mention that I wanted your perspective on in your essay is World War II as the thing that has taught us that there's a good side and a bad side to all conflicts. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Okay. So the original version of this essay was pretty much exactly twice as long as the version because I had so much to say about World War II. It really changed a lot about this form of storytelling. Like there are a lot of changes. The mass culture, good guys, bad guys story changed in a lot of ways. Including having multiple characters come together for a single moral action, like an action that has a single meaning that would take multiple characters to carry out, like the Fellowship of the Ring. No one character is able to destroy the ring, but the group of them are. And that's a kind of trope that you just don't see in earlier stories, like, you know, in The Wizard of Oz, it's like, it's ultimately just Dorothy that defeats the wizard and the witch and goes home. And the other plots of the, you know, the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man and everything, those are just independent. It doesn't matter to her plot whether they win or not. And then that changes right at the World War II mark, where suddenly, you know, virtually all the stories are about people coming together and cooperating for a single moral action. But the other thing about it is, if you look at good guy values, there's nothing in there that Nazis would not believe about themselves. Like, you can absolutely tell yourself the story that you're a good guy on any side of any conflict, which is why it works. You know, like, if you know, like, good guys, the team always has, like, they always have some, you know, multiplicity. Like, you have like Luke Skywalker type, you have the Han Solo type, you have elves, you have dwarves, you know, whatever it is, it's always like a bunch of raggedy misfits coming together. Everyone always believes that the people on their own team are the real individuals, and the people on the other team are all just like, you know, forcing everyone into conformity, but also they have no loyalty. And that is absolutely how Nazis talk about what they're doing. You know, like it's just a very persuasive way of talking about either side of any conflict.
Have you seen the? It's a skit from some British skit show. I don't know the origin, but it's called "Are We the Baddies?" Or at least that's kind of how people talk about it online. Have you seen that?
I feel like I have, but I don't remember it very clearly.
It's British comedians and they're playing like Nazi officers, and they're kind of standing around and they're wearing the full uniforms with like the death head, insignias on it. And one of them is in a very kind of nerdy voice turns to the other one and says like, "Have you ever thought maybe we're the baddies?" And it's resonant. I think I discussed this on my on Culturally Determined with when I talked to Krista Blackman. Also, we talked about this because no one is like, maybe except for serial killers or true sociopaths, no one is like, well, I'm the bad one in this situation. Everyone always thinks that what they're doing is good, and the mind is able to come up with reasons to justify the actions we're taking.
Well, and I think it's even in the good guys, bad guys story that that good guys always forgive people on their own team for whatever terrible things they do. Like, you would never have Luke Skywalker, he's got Darth Vader there dying and just being like, "Oh, sorry, son, I love you after all." And Luke Skywalker is never going to be like, "You blew up a planet, you horrible person. Like, can we talk about restorative justice or something?" Like, it's the whole plot of, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer is it's like her boyfriends like kill her friends regularly. And she's like, "Oh, well, bygones are bygones." It's like the very essence of a bad guy is that he will punish people on his own team for transgressions that will inevitably seem petty. And the very essence of a good guy, like in the new Star Wars is Princess Leia, or General Leia, sorry. It's like what she does is believe that her son will be forgivable. Like what she does is say, reach out to him, and not hold him, accountable. And like bad guys, it's like, how do you know they're bad? It's like, well, they're out there strangling people all the time. They're punishing people on their own team. And like every time anything horrifying politically happens, and I think surely somebody on this person's team is going to say, "This is horrific. You've got to, like, this is not okay." And I think, how would that even feel? Like, how does it even feel to say, like, well, I'm giving this person a pass because they're on my own team? And I think it's what we do in every single movie is rehearse that feeling of like, well, this person's on my own team, so it's okay, whatever they're doing.
Yeah, this is a psychological phenomenon. I believe it's called the fundamental attribution error, which is like, if someone is on your side and they do something not so good, you're probably thinking, well, maybe they didn't have their coffee that day, or they were in a rush, or that was just an exception. Surely they're basically a good person. If your tribal enemy does something bad, you think, well, that's just their true essence coming through, and that's who they really are.
Exactly, but if that were universal, timeless human nature, I think that we'd see it in a lot more stories that predate, the Enlightenment. I think that that went from being like some little thing that we think about sometimes to being like a major part of our everyday, wake up, pour a cup of coffee, and forgive your allies for, horrific crimes, because it's such a huge part of our storytelling now, and it just does not appear in our older things. Like there's such there's so much clarity in some of these old stories. Like, you can look at Shakespeare, and people in Shakespeare are not constantly forgiving their allies for things that that they would judge their opponents for. It's like it's just a slightly different moral texture than we have in our current stories.
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to get beyond Shakespearean complexity when it comes to who's a hero, who's a villain. We could talk about this for hours. I mean, Shylock is a super sympathetic villain who, in the end, is forced to convert to Christianity. Iago is the most compelling character in Othello, but does seem to be has motiveless malignity, which is someone's term for why Iago hated Othello. You never really know why, and he says when he's captured in the end, he says he'll bite his tongue and never speak again. These are definitely more complex villains than Darth Vader.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Or agreeing. I'm agreeing because I think, like when you look at the ethical richness of the texture of these stories, I think that Merchant of Venice is one of the only ones that comes close to having like a, values-based good guy, bad guy thing where, Jessica does switch sides when she has a change of heart. And there's this sense that it's like the values are sort of what carries the day in the end, rather than just like a person winning in a personal way. But it's still, as you said, it's so much more, it's just like a much richer texture than even when we look at, pretty complex good guy, bad guy texts. There's just like this flattening of everything. Like everything is just in the thumbs up or thumbs down. Good guy, bad guy. And like everything else within those categories, it's like, it's not going to matter that much. Like the only thing that really matters is which side of this war that's actually not between people. It's between like symbols of goodness and badness. And, it actually it dissuades you from reflecting on the meaning of your actions. Because like if you were to change your mind about something, then you'd immediately switch sides of a war, you'd give up your friends, you'd give comfort to your enemies, all of these things. Like it's so sort of disastrous to change your mind about something in the good guy, bad guy universe. That seems like that's actually the opposite of ethical deliberation.
Yeah. One thought this is prompting in me is one of the reasons that comic book movies have this weird sameness to them is the finale has to be some giant CGI battle, and the way they often do that is faceless hordes of villains fighting against our heroes. And so in Avengers, I'm a big comic book movie fan, even though most of them aren't very good. In Avengers 1, it's Loki and his army of alien gods who are coming to fight. In Avengers 2, it's Ultron and his army of robots, evil robots who are coming to fight. It looks like in Avengers 3, it's going to be aliens again. And the trailer shows all of our heroes running across a giant field to fight hordes of anonymous bad guys. So there's going to be another one. In Lord of the Rings, it's the orcs. In Star Wars, it's the stormtroopers. Yeah. When they twist this, that's what I guess more interesting. Wonder Woman, which is one of the best comic book movies that's come out in the past couple of years. It's her protecting people from the most thrilling scene in Wonder Woman is when she crosses no man's land, and it's her using her shield to protect innocent people from the German onslaught. So, I mean, but we're not, and then the big fight in the end, the spoiler alert if you haven't seen it.
I've seen it.
It turns out that she's actually fighting a fellow god, the god Ares. And so but that CGI, craziness is not as interesting as, I don't know, this thing on a more human scale where it's one person and she's more defending than attacking the nameless hordes. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but...
Well, so I thought that scene was really interesting because I was, I was working on a draft of this essay when I watched that movie. So I was sort of like keyed into every time a hero starts or a villain starts monologuing about what they're really here for, because that's when they do their little statement of values. They're like, here's what I symbolize. Here's what you will be defeating when you defeat me. Which is, again, not something that would ever show up, pre-Enlightenment, because people didn't all like, symbolize values. But the thing that she's fighting for is this idea that you should forgive humans for all the atrocities they commit during wartime. That she's like, well, I still love humans even though they're terrible. And it seemed to me like pretty clear going like as she's finishing up World War I, and she's it's like World War II is around the corner, and that that's kind of like what she's talking about is like we're about to have World War II, and it's going to be just fucking awful. Sorry
to interrupt, but they didn't have to set the movie during World War I because the character was created like I think in the 30s. But the original characterization was not necessarily a World War I story, so they made a conscious choice to do that instead of going back to World War II, which is, Captain America comes out of World War II. We've seen 10 million World War II movies, but a lot fewer World War I movies.
Yeah, I liked it as an artistic choice. I thought it was interesting. I just thought that it's amazing how frequently this idea of good guys forgiving their allies for atrocities is like that's kind of where the movie hinges. Mm-hmm. It's like whether that's the Fellowship of the Ring being that it turns out they were right to kind of bet on Gollum, or to I guess having just watched the Last Jedi, there's a whole bunch of stuff where it's like the bad guys punish, the good guys forgive. That's like the difference, and that's why the good guys win. This is always like a thing that I look for in these stories is when somebody says like this person represents goodness, the question is what do they do that has causal power in the story? And it's just about always that the good guys will forgive someone for doing something bad, or that they'll in general be like they'll allow more misbehavior on their team than the bad guys will. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to go back to Shakespeare, for instance, like if you look at the exact changes that Disney made to Hamlet to make it into the Lion King, it's like that's like an object lesson in exactly what the difference is between good guy, bad guy narratives and like what came before. Is it's like Simba like definitely does not kill Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He kind of like allows like more different people on his team. There are like more different kinds of characters on his team. Whereas Scar, it's like he didn't just murder his brother, the king. He actually is like trying to turn the entire country into a totalitarian death cult, and it's like everyone has to march in lines now, and he's like disrupting the actual cycle of birth versus death, which is like not something that was on Hamlet's plate. Like he didn't have to reestablish the series of birth and death,
Oh yeah, this is a very interesting line. Maybe we could do a whole nother conversation on this. I feel like, but yeah, and there's no.
Oh my gosh, yeah, this part of my essay got cut. Let me tell you.
There's no. I mean, when we think about Hamlet, there's no sense that is Claudius a bad king? He carouses a lot. He sleeps with his sister-in-law, but it doesn't seem like he's really doing that bad of a job. And you can't, and certainly Hamlet would not be a good king.
That's not why you're interested.
You're not by indecision.
Waiting for Denmark to finally have like somebody who represents goodness at the helm of the ship.
But then Fortinbras comes in, and Fortinbras is the idealized leader, and him coming in at the end and reestablishing order in Denmark is kind of like a the victory of the good over all the craziness that has happened.
He doesn't win because he's good. It's like, again, this is sort of like my causal power thing, where it's like you can say that someone's good, but unless they have actions that cause things to happen in the story, it's sort of just decorative. It's like you could say like, oh, Sleeping Beauty is good. And it's like, well, what does she do that's good? Like what kind of goodness does she represent? And could you just switch that? It's like, oh, she's obedient. No, now she's feisty. But it doesn't change anything in the story in terms of actual events, And I think that's that there's nothing that Fortinbras does in Hamlet that makes his orderliness have any causal power, really.
Right. Well, he displays military.
Hamlet does. That affects the outcome.
Yeah, he displays military fortitude, and his name is Fortinbras. And there's the late soliloquy where Hamlet is on the battlefield, and talks about the. I don't want to misquote it because I won't get it right. But yeah, this is interesting and maybe deserves a second conversation. Have you read Paul Fussell's The Great War in Modern Memory?
No.
The way this conversation is going made me think about this. It's a very interesting book. I recommend it to all of our viewers and listeners. It's an analysis of literature in the pre-World War I during the work by artists and poets.
Oh my gosh, I should really read that.
Who are in World War I and afterwards. And it talks about, it's a very interesting book, kind of the shattering of illusions that World War I and mechanized warfare brought about. And there used to be these ideas of valor and, the charge of the Light Brigade and all this romance surrounding war. And then the insane change, the change in the level of carnage, the level of psychological,
like the Wilfred Owen type
change
level of fascination with these tropes of glorious warfare. Yeah.
So it led to a lot of disillusionment, and it's a fascinating study. So it's called The Great War in Modern Memory.
Great. I'll check it out.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Oh my gosh. I feel like there was one more thing I wanted to. Oh, yeah, this was the last thing. And that was like when people are talking about their memories of World War II as being this amazing values fight. I think the number of countries that got involved in it for values reasons and not, say, Hitler just invaded me reasons. It looks to me like there's another, it's like explanatorily complete to not say that it was essentially about values. Like you could say this is about resources, this is about who's attacking whom. And there's so many instances where people have pulled off genocides without starting world wars, that I think that the values story is very good for getting everyone fired up and getting everyone to sign up for the army. But I don't think it's necessarily a complete explanation of why any country would join the fight if they weren't already in it.
Yeah.
And I think that, like if trade were all going well, everyone would just be like, oh, we kind of hate our neighbors. Oh, they're doing kind of gross stuff, but we're going to look the other way. It's like, I don't know, maybe that's cynical, but
yeah, this is kind of the People's History of the United States view of like U.S. actions throughout history. Is are they motivated by principles and trying to do the right thing, or is it just this was economically advantageous and this is a way to screw over the workers? I mean, like it's super complicated. In World War I, you had this bizarre alliance system that meant that the assassination of the Archduke led to the rearmament in Russia, which led to
that it all went down like dominoes.
Yeah, and then in World War II, you had You had a similar alliance system, and the invasion of Poland is what sparked it. But it was, you could say, I don't know, the value claim came later. World War II was not fought to stop the Holocaust. They didn't know it was happening at first, and then there were things they did. They could have bombed the rail lines and so on and so forth. So the moralizing around World War II is, some of it is after the fact storytelling about what really happened.
Yeah, and I think it is, like, you can't 100% tease apart the, I don't know, I was talking to a historian friend about the U.S. Civil War, the question of, like, who suits up for the North and who suits up for the South. It's like, for an individual soldier, a lot of that question is going to come down to values. And it's not explanatorily complete to just say it's all resources always when you're talking about modern nations and modern armies. But I think that the values part is often overstated because it just makes a very splashy story and an exciting story to think of values being the main point of conflict.
Yeah, and in the Civil War, I think the main value the North was fighting for was union, not abolishing slavery. That came later. The Emancipation Proclamation was not till 1863, I believe, and this is a very contested area of historiography.
It's very contested, but it's also, I think it's legitimately just too complicated to say the people who attribute it to values are wrong, or that they're 100% right. Like, both of those claims, I think, I wouldn't want to sign my name on either of those. And I think that that's why, like, once you're actually talking about modern nations, you can't just say that the values are just a fairy tale and that they mean nothing. It's like, they do mean something. They are part of the picture. They're just not as big of a part of the picture as our movies would claim, and our books, and anyway. So yeah, I guess that's the last thing I wanted to say.
Here's one more question for you. Is there a movie of this type, a good guys, bad guys story that's come out in the past couple of years that you've liked, that you thought presented morally complex, the moral complexity on both sides?
I like these movies. I've watched a ton of them, obviously. I actually just think that the way I've been engaging with them means I don't have an answer to that question that is, like, satisfying. I think that there's some, like, really interesting stuff in Harry Potter. There's some really interesting stuff in the X-Men movies. At the same time, I'm kind of just like, where is this genre heading? What are we doing with this? Rather than like, oh, this is so satisfying to my own moral feelings. I think it's really interesting how, that the shift of the focus has gone in many of them from, like, the big battle that you were talking about to sort of the slow accretion of powers that goes along with learning moral things. Like, Harry slowly learns how to be a good friend and be a good, son and a good student and whatever. And that's how he sort of slowly gets his powers. And, you have a similar thing in Twilight is another one where she, like, slowly gets her powers as she slowly kind of, like, learns all the lessons she needs to learn. And that's another thing that you see in X-Men. And I don't know, I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of storytelling heft. I just think that it may also be like we're kind of training ourselves to be worse people when we watch these movies too much.
That's a down note to end on. I just, since you mentioned X-Men, it made me think X-Men was kind of the obsession, my obsession age, like 11 to 14. And so the big X-Men villain is Magneto. And Magneto in the comics and in the movies, with the way they reboot these so often, they're going to have to stop doing this. But originally, he's a Holocaust survivor, and he goes on to form his supervillain group, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. So he's one of the few people who's explicitly saying we are evil, because he is so disgusted by what man does to man, as he experienced during World War II.
People who don't forgive every single atrocity are bad. The
Right.
people who hold people accountable, that's like an evil thing to say, I don't forgive.
Right, and it was in some ways written as, or at least came to be viewed as, the X-Men characters were kind of parable for the Civil Rights Movement, and Magneto was Malcolm X, and Professor Xavier, somewhat confusingly, was Martin Luther King. So, yeah, but Magneto is an interesting, compelling character who never... I mean, comic books go on so long, and they're always throwing new curveballs, so I'm sure Magneto was a good guy for some length of time, but...
he's been a good guy. Like, there have been parts where, like, weren't there even comic books where he was actually leading the school when Professor X was...
Oh, maybe I stopped reading it at that point.
Anyway, no, I'm definitely going to get, like, somebody's going to get angry on me at Twitter.
But the X-Men are an interesting parallel that maybe I could think about some more. So, Catherine, if people want to find out more about your work, where can they look?
Oh, more about my work in general. Well, very soon I hope I'll have a website. I should really have a website. Like, a lot of my other essays have been on Jezebel. I don't know, like...
You're on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter. I am on Twitter at CLNichols6. That's my Twitter handle.
So you should follow Catherine. You should follow me as well, ARYEHCW on Twitter. If you like Meaning of Life TV, you can subscribe on YouTube to our YouTube channel, or you can subscribe in the iTunes Store or Google Play or wherever you get podcasts. You can subscribe to Meaning of Life, and if you like Meaning of Life, you can rate Meaning of Life in the iTunes Store, which helps the algorithm suggest Meaning of Life to more people, and we'll get more people hooked on the great content here. So, Catherine, thanks so much for coming on. This is a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.